The enormous and uncompromising Galactic Empire had mastered the art of control through they believed they had unstoppable power, and that their dominion stretched beyond innumerable star systems. For them, fear was not just a tool, it was a constant in all intelligent life forms and part of the universe's inherent order. Fear guaranteed compliance, stifled rebellions, and strengthened their power. They developed techniques to induce fear throughout millennia, each one more potent than the last. Their psychological arsenal was unmatched. They created vivid illusions by accessing their prisoners' thoughts using cutting-edge neural technology. For some, drowning in endless darkness was one of their darkest fears. Their loved ones' agonized cries weren't petty pranks, rather. They were customized nightmares meant to shatter even by doing this. The strongest wills had conquered entire species resistance. Their reputation wasn't based solely on physical performances and illusions, futile when your mind went against you. Of authority strengthened their psychological strategies, and planets that ventured to rebel were swift and widespread destruction. The Empire's vessels were able to survivors related tales of their experiences with obliterating moons, which served as grim warnings of the costs of defiance. Even before the Empire's fleets arrived, terror made sure that fear spread among their tales of invincibility took on the weight of myth, and generations of people grew up knowing nothing but fear of the Empires was instilled in them from birth via servitude. The leaders of the Empire saw their culture as a survival instinct rather than just a feeling, saw this as evidence for their theory that if terror could bring a galaxy together, it must be universal, viewed the humans' capture as another chance to assert their supremacy over the species. Taken from a magnificent planet, was viewed as feeble and unimportant, for the Empire's methods had been successful in breaking one person at a time. Animals with superior intelligence, fighters with unparalleled strength, and even people whose biology seemed, since this person was painless, they believed the process had started. As usual, the person was sequestered in a room intended to magnify vulnerability. The walls moved to give the appearance of a huge void, a psychological trick to call forth the primal fear of insignificance. Lights dimmed to mimic the sounds of space's encompassing darkness. Frequencies were precisely adjusted to replicate the eerie quiet broken by the smallest echoes of imagined. Even the bravest people begged for mercy after these procedures ruined countless minds. But humans didn't respond as anticipated, rather of collapsing under the pressure of fabricated fear. The person looked about with the captives were perplexed by the lack of dread, so they adjusted with a peculiar detachment. Their strategies for intensifying the disastrous illusions views images of loved ones begging for assistance while Earth burned were projected straight into people's minds. Were the Empire's most sophisticated strategies still intended to subvert reason and target the core of a person's psyche? The absence of response from the human was not disobedience in the conventional sense, but rather apathy. The captors were perplexed as they kept an eye on the hum's physiological reactions, looking for heartbeat spikes, respiration rate variations, or distress indicators. The information confused them. Human vitals stayed steady as though fear had no power over this resistance. The captors increased their attempts by causing both psychological and physical suffering. The chamber's temperature changed from freezing to scorching, and there were roars, explosions, and cries of mayhem. Flooded the air, and innocuous yet agonizing frequencies were used. These methods had transformed even the most stoic warriors into trembling rubble, that occasionally even the captors closed their eyes, seemingly ignoring the ruckus, and started to question they had based their knowledge of dread for millennia on the conviction that fear was universal, until this human questioned that notion in ways they were unable to disregard. Therefore, they began examining people's behavior in an effort to find the mistake in, was the human immune to terror, or was this a type of resistance to their methods? In their desperation, they asked the person directly, "Why don't you fear us?" as they had never met before. When the captors queried in a frustrated tone, the human's answer was the message: fear only works if you let it. Was profound and straightforward. Their entire empire was founded on the idea that terror was an unavoidable reaction to power, yet this was foreign to the captives. People appeared to imply that fear was a decision, which was an idea that struck at them even though they had never thought of it. The core of their ideology, the captives started looking back at their previous victories to find trends. They might have overlooked if there had been more people who had defied fear but were kept quiet before their actions were noticed. In certain situations, they mistook acquiescence for fear, and these questions that were once unthinkable now consume mankind. Resilience made them face the potential that their once infallible techniques were not as effective as the studies went on. The captives discovered something surprising about themselves, and a nagging worry started to take hold for the first time. They began to wonder if their acts were morally right and effective if fear wasn't universal. May their reliance on terror cause their empire's foundations to collapse under scrutiny. Gradually, these ideas, albeit unsaid, started to spread among their members. Humans were still intact and remained a mystery that the captors were never able to unravel. They had set out to control someone else, but were doubtful of their dominance and struggled with it. Feeble species, but instead, for the first time in their lives, they were forced to face the boundaries of their strength. Throughout history, they encountered a problem that could not be solved by coercion or terror. The human presence was a silent. The authorities of the empire were disturbed by rebellion against their most cherished principles and the ramifications. Observing the incident from a distance wanted explanations for why a single person had disrupted their ranks so much. Why had the terror tactics failed? These questions, which were previously rejected as irrelevant to IR, now carried a human opposition, was more than just a failure of their strategies. It was a weight that threatened the stability of their power. Was a challenge to their comprehension of the cosmos itself. Their greatest weapon, which they once feared, now appeared to be brittle in addition to opposing their strategies. The human has sown the seeds of an uncompromising spirit. The captors were forced to deal with the truth in an empire that had never questioned its own supremacy. They never imagined that dread, albeit strong, was not total, and they initially pondered what that would mean for their dominion's future. Humans and humans have long had a complicated connection. In contrast to many species, fear does not always paralyze them. Rather, it can serve as inspiration for them to adjust and conquer, as humans have adapted to coexist with their ability to coexist by utilizing it as a survival technique instead of letting it rule their lives. Fear is ingrained in their history and culture, having developed over many generations as a result of encountering threats that were often impossible to avoid or defeat, like as wild animals or natural calamities. Dread turned into a warning indicator. This attitude goes beyond survival and is based on preparation rather than giving up. Human instincts frequently confront anxiety with defiance by employing sarcasm or comedy to lessen its impact on people, since smiling in the face of peril is not only an act of courage as a protective mechanism that allows one to take charge of the circumstance, protects individuals from hopelessness, transforming terrifying experiences into chances for fortitude. Since fear is a universal, humans have developed the ability to read emotion in ways that frequently surprise onlookers. What other creatures see as in humans view their ultimate demise as a task to overcome, and history is replete with instances of astounding humans' ability to bounce back from wars that destroyed entire nations following natural disasters. Civilizations went into hazardous areas, like the ocean's depths or space's emptiness. Each of these endeavors forced them to confront the unknown and face worries that may have easily prompted action, yet they came up with plans instead of giving up, created instruments, and relied on one another to solve problems. This flexibility is one characteristic that distinguishes them from numerous other species. Is their capacity to transform. Human curiosity and the need to explore are what motivate people to put their anxiety into action. As evidenced by their psychological constitution, they possess a special ability to concentrate on the possible benefits of an endeavor even in the face of peril. Then its dangers. While this way of thinking is not common among people, as a species has enabled people to accomplish feats that were previously thought to be impossible, including as climbing mountains. Each of these milestones required them to face and overcome the insurmountable, fly through the heavens, and land on the moon. Overcome their concerns. Humans also naturally recognize the dual nature of dread, which can be, although it can be harmful if ignored, fear can also be a motivating factor. It encourages creativity by encouraging people to plan, prepare, and safeguard themselves and their loved ones. Humans do not reject the reality of fear. They seek answers to possible threats. Instead of avoiding or repressing it, they tackle it head-on because they accept it as a part of life. They take a practical stance, accepting what they cannot control and concentrating on what they can. Becomes even more evident in the way people interact and form bonds. People find strength in connection, supporting one another in times of anxiety and uncertainty. This group reaction increases their capacity to endure hardship. They tell tales of bravery, forming cultural narratives that motivate future. These stories become ingrained in their identities, encouraging generations to face their concerns. Can be overcome by tenacity and cooperation, and when people encounter attempts to induce fear, they frequently react. Defiance is based on an innate quality rather than a sense of superiority. Humans are aware of the boundaries of fear and realize that, despite its strength, it is just momentary. They are aware that with perseverance, ingenuity, and encouragement, it is possible to overcome it. Because of this viewpoint, they are particularly resistant to strategies intended to subvert their will in public. Despite their inevitable defeat, people can grow and learn to use humor when they are afraid. Another amazing quality is that they may use laughing as a weapon to counteract the impact of fear and regain control of their feelings. This capacity to find brightness in the most dire circumstances is not a rejection of reality, but rather a confirmation of their resilience. Humor gives them perspective and serves as a reminder that no matter how bad things become, appear to be resilient, which serves as a coping strategy and a statement of defiance against dread. Realize that despite the tremendous odds, people still have hope. This hope is a deliberate trust in their capacity to overcome obstacles rather than naive optimism. It originates from their knowledge of the past and the ability to draw lessons from it. Humans are aware that fear has bounds and that those boundaries are testable and surpassable, which feeds their perseverance, which enables them to continue even when success appears doubtful. When put in fear-inducing situations, people tend to focus on the threat's origin rather than despite their spontaneous reactions. Their analytical approach enables them to spot flaws in the strategies being employed against them because of their emotional fortitude and logical thinking. Makes them challenging to overcome. Fear is a problem to be solved, not a command to follow. Viewpoint changes the power dynamics, transforming people from victims into challengers, and their capacity to express their opinions and feelings are very important, and people are quite good at communicating their experiences. Insights that assist others in comprehending their viewpoint. This dialogue cultivates compassion and unity, establishing a feeling of common purpose. By expressing their defiance, they motivate others around them. Their words serve as a rallying call, enabling them to withstand the grip of fear and transforming individual brave acts into collective movements. Humans react in a variety of ways when an enemy tries to take advantage of their anxieties. Using reasoning and intuition, they understand that fear is frequently a manipulative tactic, and control by challenging the reasons behind these attempts, depriving fear of its authority, which humans cannot readily scared since they realize that fear is based as much on perception as it is on fact. This knowledge enables them to withstand even the most advanced strategies when interacting with those who aim to. Humans frequently cultivate a composed and serene exterior in order to dominate through terror. Being composed is not the same as not being afraid. Rather, it is a conscious decision to ignore fear and concentrate on what really matters. Excessive significance they place on preserving their independence and dignity. This strategy confuses people who depend on fear to assert their authority, because failing to do so compromises their capacity to manage the circumstance. In the end, people show that fear is a variable influenced by viewpoint rather than a universal constant. Context. They refute the notion that fear has to result in submission, demonstrating that it can instead be a catalyst for development and fortitude. Their special bond with terror is evidence of their tenacity, and one quality that sets them apart and influences how they interact with the world is their ability to adapt. This allows them to flourish in even the most trying situations. The faith in the Empire's domination was based on the universality of dread, but they were compelled to reconsider this after running against opposition. Their entire system was predicated on the idea that fear was not only a normal reaction but also an unavoidable one. For the first time, flaws in their philosophy were revealed by the sudden non-compliance of one person. They had to face the fact that terror might not be as total as they thought the Empire had made it. Operated for a long time under a strict control system, where terror was seen by their culture as the ultimate equalizer that could subdue even the most powerful creatures. Fear had enabled them to triumph. Civilizations uphold order and inhibit dissent because they consider it to be universal and inherent. Their conviction was so strong that they seldom ever questioned it, but now they were confronted with proof to the. On the contrary, the Empire started reassessing its past as they dealt with this new reality. They looked at documents of historical conquests, looking for examples of resistance that could have gone unnoticed in the past, took on a new significance. All of a sudden, perhaps those who disobeyed them were only delayed in giving in to terror. It's possible that the rebels shared the same defiance that the historians and strategists of the Empire were now observing. Secure in their historical interpretation, started to recognize trends they had overlooked. This reevaluation process was uncomfortable. It tested not only their strategies but also their self-awareness. Dread had always been their greatest strength, but now, since it appeared brittle, they started to inquire about had previously been unimaginable. Was fear indeed universal? Or had it been forced upon us by if it wasn't universal? What did force and repetition signify for their empire? Could it have been a fear-based foundation? Endure if its power was no longer absolute. These considerations had far-reaching consequences if fear for generations, their entire system of government, was susceptible to failure. Assuming that terror was the most effective means of keeping control, they had used it to guarantee compliance. That presumption was incorrect. They may need to completely reevaluate their strategy. This possibility was both it introduced uncertainty into a system that had traditionally relied on predictability, making it intimidating and unsettling. Their reliance on terror was more than just a tool. It had influenced every facet of their society, including politics and culture. Numerous crimes were justified by this concept in the name of preserving order. If fear was not universal, the morality of their behavior was questioned. Even if their techniques were cruel, they had always felt that they were necessary. As they dug deeper, they encountered the unsettling possibility that their actions may have been motivated by a mistaken premise. Into these inquiries, they started to perceive fear differently. It was no longer an absolute force, but a complicated, multidimensional entity. They discovered that fear might appear in various species, and maybe even among people. What scared one? This range of answers had always existed, but it was now impossible to understand what one person may find meaningless. Disregard the fact that it made them face their own prejudices and presumptions. That people's defiance was not just an exception, but a stimulus for reflection. It revealed the boundaries of their comprehension and exposed the limitations of their perspective, which they had always considered themselves to be experts in dread, but they now recognized how little they actually understood it. This insight was both divisive, and it was so confusing that they had to own their own ignorance and reevaluate where they fit in the galaxy. They argued over whether fear was a biological instinct as their conversations about it grew more philosophical. They investigated the role of culture in either learned behavior or a combination of both. These discussions center on experience, personal psychology, and forming fear reactions. Were far from definitive, but they signaled a substantial change in their perspective since, for the first time, they were prepared to consider the potential that their comprehension of dread was incomplete. This change has real-world ramifications, as if fear wasn't universal. Their control strategies could need to adapt. They started looking at alternatives, wondering if other feelings like loyalty, respect, or even empathy could be employed to uphold order, but traditionalists within their ranks opposed these concepts, held to the idea that fear was necessary. But doubt had already been sown, and they couldn't be readily disregarded when their vision changed along with their comprehension of terror. They started to view their need on fear as a weakness rather than a strength, because it had made them oblivious to additional options and kept them from fully comprehending the entities they were trying to manipulate. This insight was both freeing and unnerving, opening doors and making them face painful memories of their past. Their connection with other animals was also affected by their reevaluation of fear, because for generations they have believed that people were less valuable since they might be intimidated. Thus they started. This change in perspective was slow, but it was necessary to recognize them as multifaceted individuals with unique perspectives and skills. Moreover, it signaled the start of a more complex comprehension of the galaxy and their role in it. Was far but simple. It forced them to face strongly held convictions and consider the basis of their many people in society opposed these changes out of fear of losing their authority and security. Fear was formerly thought to be their greatest weapon, yet the proof was indisputable. It was discovered to be a double-edged sword and could no longer be used as the only reason for their supremacy. When they realized that fear was not universal, they had to reevaluate their future. They would have to come up with new ways to rule and communicate with the galaxy, and these new ways would need inventiveness, flexibility, and a readiness to accept uncertainty. The way forward was unclear. But it would also necessitate a degree of humility that had long been lacking in their culture. There was no denying the necessity for change. Their perception of terror had drastically changed from what had previously appeared to be an unchangeable fact, but was now shown to be a mistaken presumption. This change in viewpoint wasn't without consequences, obstacles, but by overcoming fear, it also presented new opportunities. The prospect of starting to create a community founded on something more durable was intimidating, but it was also an opportunity for development and change. Fear was no longer the driving reason for their empire, rather. It was only one aspect of a far bigger picture. The interaction with the humans started to profoundly alter the empire's viewpoint. Always saw fear as a means of control, but they were now compelled to face the shortcomings of this strategy. Their capacity to withstand terror exposed them to an idea they had not thought about, which they might learn more about. stronger than coercion. Although this change was not instantaneous or widespread among the leaders of the empire, but it was important enough to inspire a new school of thinking. The empire began to view humanity differently, no longer seeing it as merely a subject to be subjugated. Humans were turned into a case study of the empire's tenacity throughout history. Trying to comprehend the psychological and cultural elements that made such resistance possible, what they found was startling and depressing, because humans as a species had prospered not by avoiding fear, but by facing and overcoming it. Their literature, art, and history were replete with instances of people who overcame overwhelming challenges and succeeded. This insight started to question the empire's long-held beliefs regarding the nature of power and strength. This new way of thinking was a deviation from the empire's conventional strategies, which historically aimed to rule and dominate by instilling fear among suppress their individualism and opposition. But now they had to consider the possibility that mutual respect and cooperation could maybe be more successful. The humans' defiance served as a spur to further investigate this concept, and the empire started to acknowledge that, despite its strength, fear was a natural restraint than conformity. But in contrast to understanding, it rarely sparked loyalty or creativity, provided the opportunity for more profound and significant relationships once the empire's focus changed. They started to research patterns from other animals they had subdued that they had not previously considered, species that had demonstrated early opposition to terror tactics and frequently displayed traits like humans, such as a strong sense of community. The empire had disregarded their ability to bounce back and their strong conviction in their principles as shortcomings, but after coming to this insight, they started to perceive them as advantages. Made them reevaluate the basis of their authority. If fear wasn't the best way to maintain control, then what was? Through discussions and observations, the empire started to recognize the human as an unintentional instructor in this process. Value of perspective. People's capacity to express their feelings and ideas gave them a glimpse into how they think. For the empire, this was a revelation that was completely alien to them. Had always worked on the presumption that their method was the only one available to them, but now they had to consider an alternative. That was, this fresh knowledge was both appealing and challenging, and it resulted in real-world adjustments to the empire's strategy. Government. They started looking into alternatives to fear-based control, testing out mechanisms that emphasize cooperation and respect for one another. These adjustments were challenging to execute. They encounter opposition from parts of the empire that adhere to conventional practices, but the data was too strong in favor of change to overlook the human resiliency that had been revealed, the shortcomings of their fear-based strategy, and they were now starting to recognize the possible advantages of a different one. The empire's perception of uniqueness underwent one of the biggest changes. Terror had always been employed, tried to repress it, establishing a standard that guaranteed adherence, but the people's defiance demonstrated the power that may result from accepting uniqueness. And the empire saw that diversity of viewpoints and ideas might spur innovation and advancement. This was a significant shift from their prior convictions, and it necessitated a substantial cultural change. Yet it further provided a more inclusive and durable course for the empire's investigation of knowledge. Did not come without difficulties. They found it difficult to balance their newly discovered appreciation for individuality with their internal disagreements arose as leaders discussed the necessity to contain this tension. Some claimed that a thorough redesign of their systems would be the best course of action. Others favored a more measured strategy. These discussions were a sign of a more significant shift inside the empire. They were no longer bound together by a shared fear and belief, but rather were starting to adopt a more sophisticated and nuanced view of power. Humans played a vital part in this change, but inadvertently, they had not attempted to alter the empire or to question its foundations. But their refusal to be afraid had set off a domino effect that made it hard to overlook. The empire's leaders started to view people as sources of inspiration rather than threats. This was a significant change in viewpoint, because it broke with the empire's long-held belief that outsiders are inferior. The internal transformation. The empire's influence extended beyond its rulers. As these novel concepts they took root and spread throughout society, reaching people who had previously tolerated fear. When a way of life started to doubt its legitimacy, the person's defiance became a symbol of tenacity, encouraging others to reevaluate their own convictions. This cultural change was gradual and frequently greeted with opposition, but it was unavoidable. The empire was evolving, and its reliance on terror was no longer its only defining characteristic. The development of empathy inside the group was one of the most important results of this change. empire had to look beyond their own experiences in order to comprehend the human perspective, which was difficult process, because it made them face their own prejudices and presumptions. But it also opened the empathy turned into a bridge that opened the way to a closer relationship with the creatures they had previously tried to manipulate. Recognize the importance of and viewpoints that differed from their own. As the empire developed more, they started to see the shortcomings of their earlier strategy, which involved using fear to establish an empire but also creating in contrast to instability and hostility. Comprehension provided the opportunity for enduring relationships and reciprocal development. This insight signaled a sea change. Throughout their history, they were no longer only known for their capacity to inspire dread, rather, they were starting to accept the strength of comprehension and cooperation. The defiance had begun as an abnormality, but it had turned become a driving force behind the empire's transition from fear to understanding presented some difficulties, but by adopting a different viewpoint, it demonstrated the strength of perspective. With a more nuanced understanding of power, they were able to stop depending on fear and start creating a community that valued resilience, uniqueness, and compassion. This change was not just in addition to being a success for humanity, the empire itself had advanced because of the humans' defiance, which had started a series of things started as an incident that would spread throughout the empire in ways that no one could have predicted. And solitary anomaly turned into a significant change in perception of the empire, once standing at a crossroads, unwavering in its reliance on fear. This change was neither immediate nor, though there remained opposition, the seeds of change had germinated. Confronting millennia of the leadership of the empire faced the challenging burden of making amends for their previous atrocities due to strongly ingrained ideology. Fear, which had served as the basis for their government, was now acknowledged by them as fundamentally defective. Its ability to exert control was indisputable, but its limitations had become equally evident, fostering subordination while inhibiting innovation and growth. And devotion. The leaders realized that long-term power needed something more durable than intimidation. They attempted to rethink their strategy despite the magnitude of what it meant. Alongside this reassessment of dread, the leaders also looked at other options. Ideas like cooperation, respect, and trust were acknowledged because they had the capacity to stability in ways that they were afraid of. These concepts were alien to them, necessitating a total change in viewpoint. They understood that in order to lead effectively, they had to motivate rather than control. Realization signaled the start of a new paradigm that prioritized human connection over control. Their reluctance to give in to fear played a crucial part in this shift and showed how resilient the human spirit is, questioning the empire's long-held assumptions and, more significantly, demonstrating that real power did not come from dominance, but the leaders who were able to persevere and adjust did not overlook this lesson. Started to doubt the basis of their authority. The humans' defiance turned into a reminder and a symbol of resistance. This change in viewpoint showed that fear was not as widespread as they had previously thought. Stretched beyond the empire's leadership, people started to reevaluate their personal relationships. They have lived under its shadow for generations, fearing it and accepting it as in defiance questioned this narrative, prompting others to consider the unavoidable aspect of human existence. Truth of their concerns. This cultural change was gradual but important, since it established the notion that their existence need not be defined by fear. And as this new way of thinking gained traction, the empire started to observe modifications to its governance policies, which were originally created to compel compliance by terror and were reassessed with an emphasis on promoting mutual understanding and collaboration. These modifications encountered opposition from individuals who held onto the old practices. But the leaders realized that their shift was gaining speed, and they accepted the challenge, since adjusting to this new reality was essential to their survival. Realizing that this change presented a chance to create a more sustainable system of government, it was not in the absence of its difficulties. The empire experienced internal strife among traditionalists, claimed that terror was required to preserve order, and opposed the move away from fear-based management. The leaders carefully managed these conflicts, viewing the new strategy as a challenge to their authority. They knew that change was unavoidable, but also acknowledged the significance of striking a balance between stability and advancement, of handling it to cause the least amount of disturbance possible. The human influence persisted in forming the empires. Their evolving viewpoint on fear and resiliency served as motivation for the leaders, as well as the human story was disseminated throughout the empire, becoming served as a reminder that fear was a force that could be overcome and was a sign of defiance and hope. And triumphed. This message struck a deep chord, igniting a feeling of empowerment that had been suppressed for a long time, But when the empire adopted this new strategy, they started to see the advantages of cooperation. They made contact with species they had previously dominated in an effort to form partnerships based on reciprocal regard. This marked a significant shift from their earlier strategies, but the alliances worked. They created were more resilient and long-lasting than any that had been created out of fear. The empire is being enhanced by fresh viewpoints and concepts in ways they never could have predicted. The empire's culture, inventiveness, and innovation were all significantly impacted by the move away from fear. Suppressed by the stifling environment of fear, people started to feel enabled to express themselves, fostering a renaissance of inquiry and thought. This cultural revival showed the possibility for development and was a monument to the strength of independence and resiliency. There were difficulties in the empire's transition when terror was no longer the ruling force, but it's also evidence of the force of change that the leaders recognized they were setting a new course that needed bravery and foresight. Understanding that their deeds would influence the empire's destiny and pave the way for this realization of an inclusive and sustainable society was both humble and empowering, since it made them aware of the responsibility they carried and the significant part that humans played in this change. However, inadvertently, their disobedience had spurred a movement calling on the empire to reevaluate its principles and priorities. Although they didn't want to alter the empire, their acts had strengthened human resiliency, became a driving force behind advancement, showcasing the strength of the human spirit and the potential of uniqueness as the empire developed further. They started to perceive themselves differently and were no longer primarily defined by their dependence on fear, rather than fostering a culture that valued fortitude, comprehension, and cooperation. This transition was not without its challenges, but it also demonstrated the effectiveness of change. The empire was evolving into something more than its previous status as an uncompromising power that represented the complexity and promise of the entities that were a part of it. The voyage was far from finished, but unquestionably, the empire was making progress. And its commanders realized they were laying a new foundation that put sustainability and inclusivity first. They understood the difficulties that lay ahead, but they also saw the possibility for development and change. This change in viewpoint was evidence of the strength of comprehension, since it illustrated the possibility of advancement when fear was no longer the motivating factor. This change had been initiated by human defiance, but the empire's readiness to adjust was what guaranteed its success. This evolution served as evidence of the strength of fortitude and the value of perspective, which served as a reminder that, despite its might, fear was not absolute. By accepting change and by putting knowledge first, the empire was able to overcome its reliance on terror and start creating a more promising future. This change represented a stride forward for the empire as a whole, as well as a victory for humanity.